Ladies and gentlemen, we all crave connection and belonging, but sometimes the ways we try to get there through control, admiration, or approval leave us feeling more isolated than ever. For the narcissist, this cycle of seeking supply becomes a trap, a desperate attempt to fill a void that can never truly be filled from the outside. This wake-up call invites us to step off the exhausting treadmill of performance and step into something far more courageous: sovereignty. It's the journey from chasing validation to owning our worth, embracing vulnerability, and finding belonging within ourselves. This is where true transformation begins. Narcissism often gets misunderstood as simply an inflated ego or a blatant need for attention, but beneath that surface lies something much more fragile and deeply human. At its core, narcissism is a complicated dance with insecurity, an attempt to create an illusion of strength by relying heavily on external validation. This reliance on supply, whether it's admiration, control, or approval, is essentially a way to patch a deep, aching void inside. It's like trying to fill a bottomless well with water. No matter how much you pour in, it never quite feels full. The illusion that others can provide what we lack within ourselves is one of the most heartbreaking and misunderstood parts of the narcissistic experience. We can see that the narcissist behaviors, the need to be admired, the constant performance, the resistance to vulnerability are all strategies to hide the vulnerability they fear most, the fear of being seen as not enough. This fear can feel unbearable, so the narcissist builds walls made of grandiosity and control to protect themselves from the shame of not measuring up. What's important to understand is that these defenses are not signs of genuine superiority, they are signals of deep insecurity. The person behind the mask often feels lost, unseen, and unworthy, even if they never admit it openly. This need for external supply comes from a place of scarcity, a belief that love, worth, and acceptance are conditional and must be earned or demanded. It's a fundamental misconception about what it means to be worthy of connection and belonging. Rather than feeling inherently enough, the narcissist believes they must constantly prove themselves, often by manipulating the narrative around them or by controlling how others see them. This creates a cycle where the narcissist's sense of self is tethered tightly to others' reactions and approvals, leaving them vulnerable to anxiety, emptiness, and disconnection when the supply runs dry. What makes this cycle so difficult to break is that it's often unconscious. The narcissist may not even realize how deeply dependent they are on this external supply because it has become their survival mechanism. They may believe that if they let their guard down, if they stop performing or controlling, they will lose everything: love, respect, status. This belief creates a constant state of tension and fear, where authentic connection feels risky and vulnerability feels like weakness. The mask then becomes not just a shield but a prison, isolating the person from the very intimacy they crave. The difficult and beautiful truth: true transformation begins the moment we recognize this illusion for what it is. When the narcissist, or anyone caught in this cycle, can start to see the difference between supply and sovereignty, the possibility of change opens up. Sovereignty in this context means owning one's worth internally rather than seeking it externally. It's the realization that no amount of admiration or control can substitute for a sense of self that is grounded, whole, and resilient. This awakening is not easy. It requires a willingness to face the parts of ourselves we have long hidden, our vulnerabilities, our fears, and our shame, and to do so without judgment. This process of awakening is often painful because it means dismantling the very defenses that once kept us safe. The narcissist must come face to face with the emptiness that the supply was trying to fill and find the courage to sit with that discomfort rather than fleeing back into old patterns. It's a journey from performance to presence, from crafting a perfect image to showing up authentically, even when it feels risky. This shift requires vulnerability, which Brené Brown so powerfully teaches is not a weakness, but the birthplace of courage, connection, and true belonging. Recognizing the illusion of supply also invites compassion, both for the self and others. It asks us to look beyond the surface behaviors and see the pain and fear that fuel them. This compassionate understanding doesn't excuse harmful actions, but allows space for empathy and the possibility of healing. It reminds us that beneath the bravado and control is a human being who is longing for the same things we all want: to be seen, loved, and accepted just as they are. Breaking free from the cycle of supply dependency opens the door to a more profound kind of freedom. It's the freedom to stop chasing external validation and start cultivating an inner life rich with self-awareness, self-acceptance, and self-compassion. Sovereignty means standing in our own truth, grounded not in how others perceive us, but in how we perceive ourselves. It's an invitation to reclaim power, not the power over others, but the power over our own story and identity. This shift is a radical act of courage because it calls us to live without guarantees. There is no promise that others will continue to supply the admiration or approval we once depended on, but in that uncertainty lies possibility. The possibility of genuine connection, rooted in authenticity rather than performance. The narcissist's wake-up call, then, is really a call to reclaim humanity, to embrace vulnerability, to cultivate resilience, and to discover the sovereignty that comes from being enough, exactly as we are. The journey from performance to presence is one of the most courageous steps anyone can take, especially for someone caught in the grip of narcissism. When someone's sense of self has been built on the approval and admiration of others, the idea of showing up authentically, without masks, defenses, or rehearsed perfection, feels terrifying. Yet it is precisely in this act of daring to be seen as we truly are that transformation begins. To move from performance to presence means to move from a life lived behind a carefully constructed facade into one where vulnerability is embraced as strength rather than weakness. Performance is about control. It's about crafting an image that we believe will earn us acceptance, admiration, or love. For the narcissist, this image often feels like armor, something to protect the fragile self underneath. It is the polished version of who they want others to see, the version they hope will be liked, valued, and respected. But this polished self is a performance. It requires constant maintenance and vigilance. It demands hiding any signs of weakness or imperfection, because any crack in the armor risks exposing the very vulnerabilities they work so hard to conceal. Rooted in authenticity, it requires showing up fully, with all of our flaws, fears, and uncertainties laid bare. Presence means allowing ourselves to be seen without the safety net of performance. This is not easy because it means stepping into a space where we risk rejection, judgment, or disappointment. It means confronting the very shame and fear that often fuel narcissistic behaviors. And yet, it is only through presence that true connection and belonging can happen. Not the superficial, conditional kind based on image, but the deep, unconditional kind rooted in truth. Choosing presence over performance demands courage, the kind of courage that Brené Brown talks about so often. It's the courage to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, and to face the unknown without the usual defenses. For the narcissist, this is especially challenging because vulnerability has long been equated with weakness or failure. They have learned to equate worthiness with being strong, successful, and admired, and so letting go of these protective performances feels like losing themselves. But true courage is about embracing our humanity, which includes our imperfections and our capacity to be vulnerable. The narcissist begins to shift their relationship with themselves and with others. Instead of seeking constant validation from the outside, they start to cultivate a sense of self that is grounded internally. This internal grounding allows them to be more present in their relationships, listening deeply, responding authentically, and engaging without the need to control or manipulate. Presence opens the door to empathy because when we show up authentically, we invite others to do the same. This shared vulnerability becomes a bridge to real connection. One of the most profound aspects of moving from performance to presence is that it changes how we relate to failure and imperfection. When we are performing, failure is not an option because it threatens the carefully constructed image. Mistakes, flaws, or moments of weakness feel like threats to our worth. But presence allows us to see failure differently. It becomes an opportunity for growth, learning, and self-compassion. We begin to understand that being fully human means making mistakes, and that our value is not diminished by imperfection. This shift also requires practicing self-compassion. Being present with ourselves means being kind and understanding when we stumble, rather than beating ourselves up or retreating into old defense mechanisms. It means recognizing that vulnerability is not a sign of inadequacy, but a fundamental part of what it means to be alive and connected. Self-compassion provides the emotional safety we need to step out of performance and into presence, because it assures us that we are enough, even when we are not perfect. The journey from performance to presence is not linear or easy. It often involves setbacks, resistance, and moments of intense discomfort. The narcissist may find themselves slipping back into old patterns of control or needing external approval when the vulnerability feels overwhelming. But each time they choose presence, each time they dare to be seen as they are, they build resilience. They strengthen their capacity to live authentically, which over time diminishes the hold that narcissistic behaviors have on their life. The wake-up call for the narcissist becomes a profound invitation to reclaim their humanity. It is a call to stop hiding behind the masks and defenses that once protected them but now keep them trapped. Presence invites them to embrace the fullness of their story, including the messy, imperfect parts. It asks them to cultivate the courage to be visible, to be vulnerable, and to trust that they are worthy of love and belonging just as they are. By moving from performance to presence, the narcissist begins to rewrite their narrative. They shift from being defined by external approval and control to being defined by authenticity and self-acceptance. This shift creates space for deeper relationships, genuine connection, and a more meaningful sense of self. Presence ultimately is about living wholeheartedly, showing up with courage, compassion, and integrity, even when it's hard. It is the heart of true sovereignty. Shame is one of the most powerful and often misunderstood emotions we experience as human beings. For the narcissist, shame can feel like an unbearable weight, a secret that must be hidden at all costs. It's the deep gnawing sense that there is something fundamentally wrong or unworthy within us, something that if revealed will lead to rejection and isolation. When the defenses of narcissism start to crack, shame rushes in, often overwhelming and paralyzing. But while shame can feel like a jailer locking us away in loneliness, it can also be a compass, a signal that points us toward what needs attention, healing, and connection. The first step in shifting shame from a jailer to a compass is recognizing it and naming it.
Shame thrives in silence and secrecy. It festers when we deny or ignore it. For the narcissist, shame is often so deeply buried beneath layers of denial, blame, and projection that it becomes almost invisible, even to themselves. But when the wake-up call happens and those layers begin to peel away, shame surfaces in powerful and often painful ways. This moment is critical because shame, while difficult to face, is also a doorway. It tells us that something in our lives or our ways of relating is not working, and it invites us to move toward transformation.
What makes shame so dangerous is its ability to isolate. It convinces us that we are alone in our feelings of unworthiness and that we must hide our true selves to be accepted. This isolation reinforces the very pain that shame inflicts, creating a vicious cycle. The narcissist often responds to shame by doubling down on defenses, building bigger walls, crafting more elaborate performances, or shifting blame onto others. These responses are attempts to escape the unbearable vulnerability that shame brings, but these strategies ultimately deepen the sense of disconnection and keep the person stuck. The wake-up call, then, is an invitation to break this cycle by leaning into shame with empathy and courage. It requires the willingness to be seen, even when it feels terrifying, and to tell our story in a way that invites connection rather than judgment. This is where empathy becomes transformative. When someone responds to our shame with empathy, when they listen without judgment, acknowledge our pain, and remind us of our shared humanity, it dissolves shame's power to isolate. Empathy creates the conditions for healing by reminding us that we are not alone and that our imperfections do not define our worth. Learning to engage with shame in this way is revolutionary. It means shifting from a posture of defense and denial to one of vulnerability and accountability. This shift is not easy. It requires a willingness to feel discomfort and uncertainty, but it is precisely this willingness that opens the door to resilience and growth. Brené Brown teaches that resilience is built through brave choices, choosing to face shame rather than running from it, choosing to seek connection rather than hiding in isolation. Another key aspect of transforming shame is understanding its difference from guilt. While guilt says, "I did something bad," shame says, "I am bad." This distinction is crucial because guilt can motivate positive change, while shame tends to paralyze and destroy. The narcissist journey involves moving from shame-based thinking to a place where mistakes and flaws are seen as part of being human, not as evidence of unworthiness. This shift allows for accountability without self-condemnation, making growth possible. As the narcissist learns to sit with shame rather than escape it, they begin to develop shame resilience. Shame resilience is the ability to recognize shame triggers, practice critical awareness of shame's messages, reach out for support, and speak shame truths. It's about building a muscle that allows us to move through shame without becoming trapped by it. This resilience not only transforms the individual, but also changes how they relate to others. Instead of projecting shame outward or using it to control, they begin to foster empathy, compassion, and authentic connection. This process of embracing shame as a compass also requires self-compassion. The narcissist often struggles with harsh self-criticism and internalized messages of unworthiness. Developing self-compassion means treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we would offer a friend in pain. It means acknowledging that suffering and imperfection are universal experiences. When shame arises, self-compassion softens its blow and creates space for healing. The wake-up call that brings shame into awareness becomes an opportunity for deep transformation. Rather than allowing shame to imprison and define them, the narcissist can learn to listen to what shame is telling them about their needs, fears, and values. Shame becomes a guidepost pointing toward the possibility of living more authentically with courage and connection. The power of shame lies not in its ability to break us, but in its potential to teach us about the parts of ourselves that have been hidden or denied. When we approach shame with empathy and courage, it invites us into a more wholehearted way of living, one where we are seen and loved, not despite our imperfections, but because of them. This transformation from shame as a jailer to shame as a compass is a vital step in the journey from supply to sovereignty. Reclaiming power through accountability is one of the most profound and challenging aspects of personal transformation, especially for someone moving from narcissistic patterns toward true sovereignty. Accountability in this context is not about blame or punishment, it's about owning our story with honesty and integrity. It means standing in the fullness of who we are, including the parts we are proud of and the parts we have tried to hide or deny, and taking responsibility for the ways we impact ourselves and others. This is radical because it calls for a deep level of self-awareness and courage that goes beyond surface-level apologies or defensiveness. Accountability can feel threatening because it challenges the carefully maintained image of perfection and control. Narcissistic behaviors often serve as a shield against shame and vulnerability, and acknowledging mistakes or harmful actions threatens to dismantle that shield. Instead of embracing accountability, the narcissist may resort to denial, minimization, or blaming others. These strategies keep them stuck in a cycle of disconnection and reinforce the illusion that their worth depends on being right, powerful, or untouchable. True accountability requires a shift in mindset from seeing responsibility as a burden or threat to seeing it as a source of power and freedom. When we own our story without excuses, we reclaim control over our lives in a way that is authentic and empowering. This kind of accountability is liberating because it moves us away from reactive patterns and toward intentional living. It allows us to break free from the grip of defensiveness and blame, which are exhausting and isolating, and instead fosters connection and growth. The process of owning our story means embracing both the light and the shadow within us. It requires humility to admit when we have caused harm and courage to make amends, even when it is uncomfortable. This is not about perfection or self-flagellation. It's about honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable. Brené Brown often talks about how vulnerability is the birthplace of courage and creativity, and accountability is no exception. It takes vulnerability to say, "I was wrong," or "I hurt you," and it takes courage to face the consequences of those truths. Accountability is practiced with empathy and intention. It also creates space for forgiveness, both from others and from ourselves. The narcissist's journey toward sovereignty is not about achieving flawlessness, but about committing to growth and healing. By taking responsibility for past actions and making conscious choices to change, they demonstrate a new kind of strength, one that is grounded in integrity rather than control. Accountability also shifts the relationship between power and connection. Narcissism often confuses power with control over others, but true power comes from owning one's own story and actions. This internal power does not require dominating or manipulating others. Instead, it invites collaboration, respect, and mutuality. When we are accountable, we show that we respect others enough to be truthful and that we respect ourselves enough to live authentically. This kind of power fosters trust and deepens relationships. Another important aspect of reclaiming power through accountability is recognizing that it is an ongoing practice, not a one-time event. It requires continual self-reflection and willingness to check in with ourselves and others. Sometimes accountability means having difficult conversations, setting boundaries, or making amends. Other times it means recognizing when we've slipped back into old patterns and recommitting to the path of growth. This ongoing commitment is a sign of strength and maturity, not weakness. This ongoing accountability can feel daunting because it requires letting go of old defense mechanisms and embracing uncertainty. But it also offers the possibility of healing the wounds that fuel narcissistic behavior in the first place. By owning their story, they can begin to rewrite the narratives of shame, fear, and unworthiness that have shaped their identity. This rewrite is an act of reclaiming power, not the power over others, but the power to live with authenticity, compassion, and integrity. Reclaiming power through accountability is a gift to ourselves and to those around us. It invites us into a more wholehearted way of living, where we are no longer controlled by fear or ego, but guided by honesty and courage. It challenges us to show up as our true selves, to embrace our imperfections, and to build meaningful connections based on trust and respect. This journey is not easy, and it requires patience and persistence. But with each step toward accountability, the narcissist moves closer to sovereignty, a place where they can live freely, fully, and with purpose. It's a journey of transformation that invites us all to be brave enough to own our stories and bold enough to become the people we were always meant to be. The gifts of discomfort are some of the most powerful teachers on the journey from supply to sovereignty, especially for someone grappling with narcissistic patterns. Discomfort often shows up as an unwelcome visitor, an uneasy feeling, a vulnerability we try to avoid. Yet it is precisely in these moments of discomfort that growth happens. For the narcissist, who has long relied on external validation and control to feel safe, leaning into discomfort can feel like stepping off a cliff without a safety net. But it is in that leap into uncertainty, vulnerability, and the unknown that true transformation unfolds. Discomfort is often a signal that we are confronting something important. It can feel like an internal alarm, alerting us that our usual ways of coping or defending ourselves are no longer serving us. For the narcissist who has built a fortress around their sense of self, discomfort might arise when the carefully maintained structures of control and supply start to crumble. This can be terrifying because it threatens the very identity they have constructed. Yet, if we can learn to listen to discomfort rather than run from it, it becomes a gateway to deeper self-awareness and healing. One of the biggest challenges is that our culture often teaches us to avoid discomfort at all costs. We seek comfort, certainty, and quick fixes. But real growth rarely happens in the comfort zone. It requires us to lean into uncertainty, to be willing to feel awkward, vulnerable, and even afraid. Brené Brown talks about this as the essence of courage, choosing to be vulnerable despite the risks. For the narcissist, this courage means stepping away from the endless pursuit of approval and control and stepping into the messiness of authentic living. Discomfort also forces us to confront parts of ourselves that we might have denied or suppressed. It shines a light on our fears, insecurities, and unmet needs. This process can be painful because it challenges the narrative we have told ourselves about who we are. For example, the narcissist might have believed they were invincible or always in control, but discomfort reveals the cracks in that illusion. This revelation is not a sign of failure, but an opportunity to engage with our true selves more honestly. Discomfort is not something to be fixed or eliminated, but to be embraced as a teacher. When we allow ourselves to sit with discomfort, rather than numb it or escape it, we develop resilience. This resilience is the capacity to face life's challenges with strength and grace. It is built through practice. Each time we choose presence over avoidance, vulnerability over defense, we grow stronger. Another gift of discomfort is that it deepens our empathy and connection with others. When we experience discomfort ourselves, we become more compassionate toward others' struggles. This empathy breaks down isolation and fosters meaningful relationships. For the narcissist, who may have struggled with authentic connection due to defensive behaviors, embracing discomfort opens the door to genuine intimacy. It allows them to relate to others not from a place of control or superiority, but from a place of shared humanity. The wake-up call embedded in discomfort is an invitation to reevaluate what matters most. It asks us to examine the stories we tell ourselves and the values that guide our actions. For the narcissist, this might mean recognizing that external supply, whether it's admiration, power, or control, is a temporary and ultimately unsatisfying source of worth. Discomfort invites a shift toward internal sources of strength, such as integrity, vulnerability, and self-compassion. This shift requires patience and self-compassion because the path through discomfort is often winding and uncertain. There will be moments of doubt, fear, and setbacks, but these moments are part of the process, not signs of failure. Each time the narcissist chooses to stay present with discomfort, they build what Brené Brown calls wholehearted living, a way of being grounded in authenticity, courage, and connection. Embracing discomfort might look like having difficult conversations, facing past mistakes, or sitting with feelings of loneliness or inadequacy without trying to escape. It means resisting the urge to retreat into old patterns of control or manipulation and instead allowing vulnerability to guide our actions. This is where true sovereignty begins, a place where we are no longer ruled by the need for supply but are anchored in our own worth. Discomfort also teaches us about boundaries, recognizing what is healthy and what is not in our relationships and environments. It invites us to say no when necessary and to protect our emotional and psychological well-being. For the narcissist, learning to set boundaries from a place of self-respect rather than control is a profound step toward healing and autonomy. The gifts of discomfort are a reminder that transformation is not comfortable or easy. It is a messy, nonlinear process that demands courage, persistence, and self-love. But within that discomfort lies the potential for a richer, more authentic life, one where we are no longer dependent on external supply, but are sovereign in our sense of self and belonging. This journey through discomfort is not just about surviving difficult emotions, it's about thriving because of them. It is about discovering that the most profound growth often happens in the places we fear to go. By leaning into discomfort, the narcissist takes a courageous step toward waking up, not to a life defined by others' approval, but to a life defined by true presence, integrity, and wholeheartedness. The path to authentic connection is perhaps the most essential and transformative aspect of moving from supply to sovereignty. For the narcissist, connection has often been transactional, based on what they can get from others in terms of admiration, validation, or control. Relationships become a stage where they perform and extract supply to bolster their fragile sense of self. But authentic connection, the kind that nourishes and sustains, requires vulnerability, empathy, and mutuality. It asks us to show up as our whole selves, not as a curated image designed to impress or manipulate. Authentic connection begins with vulnerability, a concept Brené Brown has explored deeply throughout her work. Vulnerability is the willingness to be seen, really seen, without pretense or protection. For someone entrenched in narcissistic patterns, this is especially challenging because vulnerability feels like exposure to judgment or rejection. The masks and defenses that have been carefully constructed to hide insecurities must come down. But it is precisely in this act of courageous vulnerability that true connection is born. When we allow ourselves to be seen fully, imperfections and all, we invite others to do the same. This vulnerability creates a foundation for empathy, which is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Empathy is the antidote to shame and isolation, and it is critical for authentic connection. The narcissist often struggles with empathy because their focus has been inward, centered on self-preservation and external validation. Learning to practice empathy involves shifting attention outward to genuinely listen and respond to others' experiences without judgment or the need to fix. This shift is profound because it dismantles the barriers between self and other, opening the way for genuine human connection. Mutuality is another cornerstone of authentic connection. It means that relationships are not one-sided or transactional, but are based on reciprocity and respect. Both parties bring their full selves to the relationship, and both receive and give care, support, and understanding. For the narcissist, this requires a fundamental reorientation away from using others as sources of supply towards seeing relationships as shared spaces of growth and belonging. Mutuality demands humility, the recognition that we do not have all the answers and that we need others to be fully human. Building authentic connections also requires boundaries that are clear and compassionate.
Boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but are necessary structures that protect our emotional health and integrity. For the narcissist, setting boundaries can be difficult because they may be used to pushing limits to maintain control or to gain approval. Learning to establish healthy boundaries is an act of self-respect and care, enabling relationships to thrive without codependency or manipulation. Boundaries create the safety needed for vulnerability and trust to flourish. Trust itself is a fragile but vital element of authentic connection. Trust is built over time through consistent honesty, reliability, and openness. For the narcissist, who may have struggled with trust due to fear of exposure or rejection, cultivating trust requires patience and persistent effort. Trust grows when vulnerability is met with empathy, when boundaries are respected, and when accountability is practiced. It is the glue that holds connections together and allows them to deepen beyond superficial interactions. Another important aspect of authentic connection is embracing imperfection. No relationship is perfect, and expecting perfection often leads to disappointment and disconnection. Authentic connection invites us to accept ourselves and others with compassion and grace, recognizing that flaws and mistakes are part of the human experience. This acceptance fosters a sense of belonging that is not conditional on being flawless or always on. For the narcissist, learning to embrace imperfection is liberating because it frees them from the exhausting need to perform or control. The journey toward authentic connection also involves healing past wounds. Many who struggle with narcissistic tendencies have experienced early relational trauma or neglect that shaped their defenses and coping mechanisms. Healing requires revisiting those wounds with compassion and seeking connection in ways that were previously unavailable. This healing process is often supported by safe relationships where vulnerability is met with empathy rather than judgment. Authentic connection is ultimately about belonging, being accepted and loved for who we truly are, not for what we can do or how we appear. This belonging is the antidote to the loneliness and fragmentation that narcissism often masks. It is the soil in which sovereignty can grow because when we feel deeply connected, we no longer need to seek external supply to feel worthy. Our sense of self becomes grounded in the reality of mutual care and respect. This kind of connection requires ongoing practice and commitment. It calls us to show up again and again even when it feels risky or uncomfortable. It asks us to listen more deeply, to be more present, and to offer kindness and understanding, both to ourselves and to others. It invites us to lean into discomfort and to choose courage over comfort. Through this practice, authentic connection becomes not just a goal but a way of living, a life marked by presence, empathy, and wholeheartedness. For the narcissist awakening to this truth, authentic connection is the ultimate wake-up call. It reveals that the supply they once chased is a pale imitation of the belonging and love that real relationships provide. It shows that sovereignty is not about being above others, but about being deeply intertwined with them in honest, vulnerable, and reciprocal ways. This awakening transforms not only how they relate to others, but how they relate to themselves, inviting a life lived with greater freedom, integrity, and joy. The journey from supply to sovereignty is not a linear path or a quick fix. It is a courageous, messy, and deeply human process. It calls us to face our vulnerabilities, own our stories, and embrace discomfort as a gateway to growth. For the narcissist, this awakening is a radical act of bravery, dismantling old defenses, stepping into accountability, and learning to connect authentically with oneself and others. Sovereignty is not about control or perfection. It is about reclaiming our power through honesty, empathy, and wholehearted living. When we choose this path, we move from seeking validation outside ourselves to finding belonging within, and in that belonging, we discover true freedom, freedom to be seen, to be imperfect, and to be fully alive.